There are many Napoleon Bonaparte I. There is the heroic Napoleon, who fired the imagination of poets, writers, painters, musicians, playwrights, and filmmakers. There is the mythical Napoleon, subject of countless stories and anecdotes that praise his charm and accomplishments. There is also Napoleon the villain, reviled for his obsession with power and his ruthless means of attaining it. And then, of course, there is Napoleon himself, the man, the emperor, the conqueror. It's difficult and sometimes impossible to separate history from legend when trying to talk about Napoleon Bonaparte. In this session, we're going to try. What is clear from the beginning is that Napoleon is one of the most celebrated leaders in Western history. Like all great military leaders, he had an uncanny ability to inspire love and devotion in his followers, even when his actions didn't serve their best interests. His public seldom recognized the Napoleon who could be egotistical and merciless. They recognized only his strong leadership and the fame and glory he was bringing to France. Eventually, like a character from a Shakespearean tragedy, his relentless ambition would be his own downfall. By the time he'd finished his doomed campaign to make of France a vast empire, the country was smaller in size than when he started, yet still he was revered. Before his downfall, Napoleon would have an extraordinary effect on France and all of Europe. He carried out many liberal reforms that left a lasting mark on the institutions of every Western European country. In France, he revolutionized the organization and training of the military. He reformed the education system and the universities. He established the Banque de France and the financial organization of the nation. And he introduced the famous Napoleonic Code, which still forms the basis of civil law in France. But these were just his domestic achievements. Meanwhile, he managed to consolidate most of Europe as one empire. By the year 1804, his military and political power extended throughout continental Europe and failed only to encompass Great Britain. And in every country he acquired, he initiated social and political reforms that helped define these countries as we know them today. In a period of only 20 years, Napoleon Bonaparte completely changed the political and geographical map of Europe. The nation he so dramatically altered was not even the nation to which he was born. Napoleon was born August 15, 1769, on the island of Corsica in the Mediterranean Sea. His parents were of Italian nobility. Corsica had belonged to Genoa, a city-state of Italy, before France purchased it the year before Napoleon's birth. The family name was Bonaparte. Napoleon would change it to Bonaparte years later in France. Carlo Bonaparte, Napoleon's father, was a lawyer. His mother, who married when she was only 14, was said to be very beautiful and strong-willed. As a child, Napoleon was short-tempered and insisted on having his own way. He kept to himself and hated playground play, with the exception of snowball fights, which he orchestrated into miniature wars. He had a reputation for hating to lose. His brother told stories about how the little Napoleon, when playing chess, would sneak back onto the board the pieces he'd lost. At school, when the teachers had the students act out wars from history, Napoleon always refused to be on the side that was defeated. One teacher described him as granite heated by a volcano. When he was 9, Napoleon enrolled in a military school in France. The future genius of the battlefield was only an average student, although he did excel in mathematics. Because of this, he was selected for an elite military academy in Paris, from which he graduated in 1785 at the age of 16. The same year he graduated, his father died of a stomach cancer, leaving the family in difficult financial straits. Napoleon became head of the family, though he was still a teenager. At this point, Napoleon joined an artillery regiment of the French army, where he was promoted to first lieutenant and then to captain. He also joined a radical French political society known as the Jacobins, and soon became their president. The goal of the Jacobins was to make France a democratic republic, and Napoleon often gave speeches against nobles, monks, and bishops, the members of the French ruling class. While Napoleon was in the army, the French Revolution occurred. Napoleon had read Voltaire and Rousseau, two writers whose work had helped inspire the revolution, and he himself believed that political change was essential. Napoleon fought briefly in the revolution, but then took a leave and spent many months back home in Corsica, serving in the National Guard. The governor of Corsica, Pascal Paoli, was a royalist who supported the King of France, and he wasn't pleased with Napoleon's membership in the Jacobins. When King Louis was guillotined by the revolutionaries, Paoli promptly declared the Bonapartes outlaws. The family fled to France. Napoleon returned to the French army, and destiny began to play its hand. To understand the rise of Napoleon, one must first have some understanding of the climate in France after the Revolution and the famous Reign of Terror, when French citizens ruthlessly executed hundreds of aristocrats and so-called traitors. The period after this was still unstable and volatile. Various political groups formed, all of them with different goals and ideas about how the new republic should be governed. They fought amongst themselves. There were rebellions against those currently in power, and there continued to be intrigues, assassinations, imprisonments, and executions. It was not like the post-revolutionary period in America, where, although much debate occurred, the people quickly agreed on a constitution, organized a government, and elected a popular president. In France, a period of chaos continued after the ousting of the monarchy, and periods of chaos and instability, as history proves, are fertile ground for the rise of strong, even dictatorial leaders. It was on this fertile ground, where people so desperately needed unity and direction, that Napoleon Bonaparte found himself in the last decade of the 18th century. In 1793, 4 years after the Revolution, a group of Jacobins led by the famous Maximilien Robespierre, a brutal leader in the Reign of Terror, took control of the French government. In response, many French cities revolted against Robespierre. In the city of Toulon, the British naval fleet came to the aid of the rebels. Napoleon was sent to take command of the artillery. It would be the first of many great battles between the little Corsican and the forces of Great Britain. It would also be Napoleon's first military victory. Napoleon scanned the terrain, positioned his artillery on high ground, and fired down on the panicking British. They retreated, and when the smoke had all cleared, Napoleon had earned his way to the title of Brigadier General. He was 24. The luck at Toulon lasted only a year. In 1794, Robespierre fell from power and was executed. Napoleon, considered to be one of Robespierre's supporters for his role at Toulon, was thrown into prison. With characteristic charm, he talked his way out and was free within a week. He returned to the army and to bigger and better things. In 1795, Napoleon had yet another chance to prove his heroism and his cold-bloodedness in a famous incident known as the whiff of grapeshot. This time, angry mobs in Paris were trying to attack the ruling National Convention at the Royal Palace in the Tuileries. The mob, with the support of royalists, was hoping to destroy the convention and install a more moderate government instead. Called in to defend the palace, Napoleon went right for the big guns. He aimed point-blank cannon fire at the crowd, killing and wounding hundreds of people. The rebellion was quelled, and Napoleon had won yet another promotion, this time to Major General. It was won, said his detractors, by a mere whiff of grapeshot. The new government, made up of 5 different directors, was installed. It was called simply the Directory. After the whiff of grapeshot, Napoleon, who had already had several affairs in his life, decided to settle down and marry. He chose Josephine de Beauharnais, a beautiful woman of French descent from the island of Martinique. Her first husband had been sent to the guillotine during the Revolution, and she had 2 children, one 12 and one 14. At the time Napoleon met her, Josephine was a leader of fashionable French society. She was 6 years older than Napoleon and quite experienced in the ways of the world. 2 days after he married her, Napoleon set out for Italy and for his first major step on his rise to power. After the French Revolution, France had been at war with much of Europe, and its prime enemy had been Austria. Austrian troops were now gathered on the Italian-French border, and in 1796 Napoleon was dispatched there with an ill-equipped force of 38,000 men. When he'd first seen them in Nice, he had told them, "Soldiers, you are naked, badly fed. Rich provinces and great towns will be in your power, and in them you will find honor, glory, wealth. Soldiers of Italy, will you be wanting in courage and steadfastness?" Napoleon's words never failed to ignite his men, and this time was no exception. They followed him to Italy, where their task was to keep the Austrian force busy while larger French armies attacked Vienna. Napoleon didn't keep the Austrian forces busy. Instead, he soundly defeated them and won the war. In less than 1 year, he defeated 4 armies, all larger than his own. Then he marched over the Alps to take Vienna himself, but the Austrians quickly signed a treaty, and he was deprived of his final show of glory. Nevertheless, he returned to France a hero once again. It was during this war, at the Battle of Lodi, that Napoleon earned the nickname Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal. It happened when he impressed his troops by personally aiming the cannon, a dangerous job usually left to a corporal. Napoleon was only 5 feet 2 inches tall, which actually was average for a Frenchman of his time. He was called Little because most French generals and statesmen were taller. Some years later, when he was emperor, Napoleon was reaching for a book in his library when a friend offered to assist him, saying, "Permit me, sire, I am higher than your majesty." Napoleon curtly responded, "No, you are longer." By now, Napoleon had developed a highly successful military strategy that he would use in all his future campaigns. The strategy was simple, but devastatingly effective. Napoleon held back his forces at the beginning of a battle, sending in only the smallest force possible. Then he would watch and find the weakest point in the enemy lines. Once he identified it, he would throw all the strength of his reserve forces against that point at the most decisive moment of the battle. He had a phenomenal ability to recognize the best time to attack. After his Austrian victory, Napoleon's political ambitions began to rise, but he felt he didn't quite have the military reputation needed to gain control of the government, so he set out to strengthen it even further. He proposed to the Directory, the ruling government, that he invade Egypt in an attempt to destroy Britain's trade with the Middle East. The Directory agreed. In Egypt, Napoleon defeated its military forces at the famous Battle of the Pyramids near Cairo. But there was little time to rejoice. A month later, the British, under the direction of Lord Horatio Nelson, destroyed the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay. That left Napoleon's army stranded in Egypt with no way out. Confined in Egypt, Napoleon found an outlet for his enormous energy by introducing Western political institutions and administrations. He helped set up schools and hospitals. He started irrigation projects. He even laid plans for a grand canal at Suez, linking the Mediterranean and Red Seas. The group of scholars he brought with him from France discovered the Rosetta Stone, which became the key to the understanding of ancient languages. Napoleon learned Arabic while he was in Egypt, and for a while claimed he intended to become a Muslim. While all this was going on, nearby Turkey formed an alliance with Britain and Russia and declared war on France. This was just the inspiration Napoleon needed. He marched into Syria, then ruled by Turkey, and advanced as far as what is now known as Israel. While Napoleon was busy in Syria, Turkey was marching into Egypt. So Napoleon did an about-face, zoomed back to Egypt, and defeated the Turks at Aboukir. This, however, was not the end of France's troubles. Russia and Great Britain had formed another alliance against France, this one with France's old enemy Austria, and together they had defeated the French army in Italy. Napoleon took off for home, where he received yet another hero's welcome, this time for his victory over the Turks. His heroic deeds in Egypt couldn't have come at a better time. Back in France, the people had lost confidence in the Directory, and the defeat of the French army in Italy had only made matters worse. Napoleon now had the military reputation he'd hoped would give him more influence. It did. He quickly formed some key political alliances, joined a conspiracy already in the works, and seized control of the French government. He proposed a new constitution that replaced the disgraced Directory with a three-member consulate. The first consulate was, of course, Napoleon himself. The other two were mere advisors. The French people overwhelmingly approved the consulate, and Napoleon could now rule as dictator of France. One of Napoleon's first acts was to set right the defeat the French army had suffered at the hands of the Austrians in Italy. His army marched into Italy, surprised the Austrians in Marengo, and forced them to sign a treaty. The British, weary of many years of war, signed a treaty the following year. Russia had willingly dropped out of the coalition against France already, and so, for the first time in 10 years, all of Europe was at peace. It was not to last. This period of peace is historically considered the divide between the French Revolutionary Wars, which preceded it, and the Napoleonic Wars, which followed it. In France, Napoleon set out to reform and reorganize almost every area of government. He was a liberal ruler, and many of his reforms were long-lasting and beneficial. He divided France into départements, or departments, and appointed prefects to administer each one. He stabilized the economy and reformed the tax system. His greatest achievement was the revision of French laws into what he called codes. There were 7 of them, and they incorporated many of the freedoms gained during the French Revolution, including religious tolerance and the abolition of serfdom. The most famous of these codes, the Code Napoleon, is still the basis of French civil law. He also gave full citizenship rights to the Jews in France, and he turned his attention to cultural needs, lending support to the Louvre Museum and to the Bibliothèque Nationale, the National Library. But all was not light and cheer under his rule. He also had newspapers censored to silence his critics. If he feared an army general, he would have him imprisoned or secretly murdered. He had royalist opponents hunted down and shot. Once he even had a royalist kidnapped from Germany and returned to France for execution before a firing squad. The former French revolutionaries praised this act, but the rest of Europe found it shocking and frightful. When he heard of their criticism, Napoleon responded, "Pooh, what does the life of one man mean?" In some ways, the government of Napoleon Bonaparte was becoming more and more like the monarchy France had deposed 15 years earlier. The French, for the most part, seemed unaware of this, but the rest of the world was watching and growing more and more fearful. By now, Napoleon was 30 years old. He was thin, and he wore his hair cut close to the head, earning him yet another nickname, Le Petit Tendu, or Little Crop Head. He took particular pride in his hands, which were delicate and had perfectly manicured nails. He loved hot baths and would sometimes sit in a tub for 2 hours, demanding hotter water temperatures in times of crisis. Napoleon's vanity was famous. He took great pleasure in encouraging writers, artists, and musicians to make him the subject of their works. He was a man who seldom laughed, and when he did, it came in wild outbursts. He was known to be impatient, particularly with people who couldn't keep up with his energy or his quick mind. He often used insults and rage to intimidate people, and he never was known to apologize. He had no true intimate friends and once said, "Friendship is only a word. I care for nobody." As first consul, Napoleon worked as much as 16 hours a day, and he expected the rest of the council to show the same stamina. One night when they dozed off, he scolded them with, "Do let's keep awake, citizens. It's only 2 o'clock. We must earn our salaries." His superhuman abilities were deeply admired by his followers, one of whom commented, "God made Bonaparte, and then he rested." This prompted a royalist to respond, "God should have rested a little earlier." The sweeping changes he was making in France, important as they were, couldn't satisfy Napoleon's appetite for adventure and power. He began to think about expanding his influence in the Western Hemisphere. In 1780, he forced Spain to grant France the Louisiana Territory in North America. However, his plans for North America failed when he sent an army to take possession of the territory, and the army was destroyed en route to Haiti, the victim of tropical disease and a slave revolt. He sold the territory to the United States 3 years later to help pay for his impending war with Britain. The price was $15 million. Thwarted in America, Napoleon turned his attention to Italy, where France had already annexed the northern region called Piedmont. He proclaimed himself President of the Italian Republic, and then looked around for an even more impressive title that he could use at home. He settled on the title Emperor. Napoleon felt that the best way to discourage conspiracies was to create a hereditary empire. He felt safe from assassination as long as there were heirs who could simply take his place. In 1802, the French people had approved a constitutional amendment that made Napoleon first consul for life. Now, 2 years later, they voted him their emperor. Napoleon wanted a coronation that would be grander than the coronation of French kings. He decided he could accomplish this if he was crowned by the Pope himself. Pope Pius agreed to come to Paris, and the ceremony took place on December 2, 1804, at Notre Dame Cathedral. At the last minute, to the surprise of all who attended, and to the utter shock of the Pope himself, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. Then he set his sights on obtaining a kingdom that was worthy of the title. Napoleon's first step in expanding his empire was in 1805, when he led his troops into Germany and defeated Austrian and Russian armies at Ulm and at Austerlitz. Austerlitz is considered one of his most brilliant battles. The Europeans had been forming coalitions against France again, alarmed at the power and ambition of its new emperor. Austria, Russia, Sweden, and Britain were now united in their determination to keep those ambitions from being realized. Britain, for one, was fairly safe from the threat of Napoleon. Admiral Nelson had destroyed the fleets of both France and its ally Spain the previous year, a victory that gave Britain control of the seas and ended any chance of a French invasion. But Britain had reason to be concerned anyway. Its allies and all of Europe were vulnerable. By now the Russians and Austrians had a new ally, Prussia. Prussia was then a large state in northern Germany that was later divided among East and West Germany, Poland, and Russia. Through 1806 and 1807, Napoleon fought repeated battles against these allies. He won them all, and with each win his empire grew. So did his descendants. In Warsaw, Napoleon fell in love with Countess Maria Walecka, a Polish patriot who hoped Napoleon would reunite her country. Napoleon had a son by her. Now a number of German states were under his jurisdiction. He carved provinces of Germany and Italy and put them in control of his relatives and friends. His 3 brothers and his sister each had one piece of the empire. In 1807, the French gained control of Portugal and occupied parts of Spain, including Madrid. The entire map of Europe was being rearranged. In 1810, Napoleon brought his empire to its climax when he annexed Holland and much of Germany that he hadn't already annexed. The empire was almost in place. There was only one problem that haunted the Emperor Napoleon. He had no heir for this glorious empire. Josephine had borne no children, and now at age 46, it was doubtful she ever would. In 1809, Napoleon divorced her and married a younger and hopefully more fertile woman, the Archduchess Marie-Louise, daughter of an emperor of Austria. A year later, Napoleon had his heir, a son, also named Napoleon, who later became known as Napoleon II. At birth, his father also gave him the title King of Rome. It seemed now as if all he dreamed was finally within Napoleon's grasp. And it was at this moment, when his future felt assured, that Napoleon's grasp began to falter. Napoleon had established a system by which he hoped to destroy British trade with Europe. British ships were barred from ports under French control. Ships of neutral nations were not allowed to carry British goods into Europe. If they did, they were attacked by the French Navy. These rules were called the Continental System. Portugal, a longtime friend of Britain, refused to follow the system, even though it was under French control. It formed an alliance with Spain and rebelled, along with help from British troops. Together they managed to drive out all the French forces, a war in which tens of thousands of French soldiers lost their lives, and Napoleon lost a good deal of his prestige. The next disaster was in Russia, and it was a sizable one. In 1810, the Tsar, too, withdrew from the continental system that controlled British trade, and so Napoleon assembled a new army and prepared to attack. His former army, depleted and exhausted by years of battles, was in no shape to take on a giant like Russia. Napoleon raised about 600,000 soldiers by drafting men from his allies and annexed territories, and called it his Grande Armée. These 600,000 went out in confidence to meet the mere 200,000 Russians that awaited them. The confidence was misplaced. The French forces fought 2 battles with the Russians, but each time the Russians retreated, depriving the French of a victory. Finally, Napoleon pushed his troops on to Moscow, but to his dismay, he found the city deserted. Furthermore, retreating Russians had set many parts of the city on fire and burned the fields that would have supplied food. Napoleon waited in Moscow for the Tsar to surrender, but no surrender came. Finally, completely out of supplies, it was Napoleon's turn to retreat. The bitter winter was approaching, and already there were heavy snowstorms, and the temperatures were freezing. Soldiers and horses died from starvation and exposure, and Russian soldiers killed anybody left behind. Of the 600,000 men who left with Napoleon for Russia, only 100,000 returned, and of those, only 10,000 were fit for battle. The 500,000 men he'd lost had either died, been taken prisoner, or had deserted. There's a story from these Russian battles that illustrates the callous and cynical view Napoleon sometimes took of his enemies. It was outside the city of Smolensk, which the Russians had also set afire before retreating. Napoleon watched the blaze with his aides and compared it to an eruption of Vesuvius. When one of his aides commented that the fire was a horrible sight, Napoleon snorted with contempt and responded, "Remember, gentlemen, as one of the Roman emperors remarked, the corpse of an enemy always smells sweet." Yet, typical of the contradictions which surround Napoleon, there's another story from the same war that illustrates his compassion. It was after the Battle of Borodino, a battle Napoleon considered the most terrible he'd ever fought. Losses had been great for both the Russians and the French. The next day, his aides rode over the battlefield counting the dead. They came across one body that let go a cry of pain, and Napoleon hastily called a stretcher. "It's only a Russian, sire," said one of the aides, to which Napoleon replied, "After a victory there are no enemies, only men." Which story reveals the true Napoleon? Undoubtedly both. There are as many stories about his kindness and generosity as there are of his cruelty and indifference. He was a complex man, a blend of humanism and selfishness, of self-will and universal ideals. In spite of Napoleon's tremendous loss in Russia, the French public continued to support Napoleon. His enemies, however, were heartened by the disaster, and from then on they intensified their efforts to end his campaign once and for all. They announced they were not fighting the French people. They were fighting only Napoleon. The alliance against Napoleon now included Austria, Great Britain, Russia, Sweden, and Prussia. Napoleon, never one to sit idly by, took the offensive. His first battles at Lutzen, Bautzen, and Dresden were successful, but his forces were badly outnumbered. In October, he fought enemy forces at Leipzig, in what is known as the Battle of the Nations. He lost and retreated into France, but the Allies were right behind. They captured Paris in 1814 and forced Napoleon to abdicate his throne. The Allies put Louis XVIII on the throne, brother of Louis XVI, who was executed in the Revolution, and they exiled Napoleon to the small island of Elba off the northwest coast of Italy. His wife and son were sent back to Austria, and Napoleon never saw them again. Before departing for Elba, Napoleon first tried to poison himself, but he failed. Finally, he sailed from France with a guard of 400 volunteers, a guaranteed annual income of 2 million francs, and his title of emperor, which he'd been allowed to retain. Napoleon was not bored on Elba. Instead, he spent his time plotting his return, A year later he sailed to Caen with 1,100 of his followers and began marching to Paris, gathering troops along the way. Meanwhile, troops from Paris were on their way to meet and arrest him. But when they saw their former leader, the men sent to arrest him instead joined forces with him and hailed him once again as their emperor. The king fled from Paris, and Napoleon made a victorious entry, carried on the shoulders of the cheering crowds. The first thing Napoleon did when he returned was to proclaim a new constitution that limited his own powers. He vowed to his enemies that he would keep the peace. They didn't believe him, and both sides began to prepare yet again for war. Napoleon's idea of keeping the peace was to head for Belgium with 125,000 troops to take on the combined forces of Britain and Prussia. The British forces were headed by the Duke of Wellington. The Prussian forces were headed by Marshal Gebhard von Blücher. On June 16th, Napoleon defeated Blücher at Ligny, but on June 18th he marched toward Wellington's troops in a field near a town named Waterloo. He was about to begin one of the most famous battles in world history, and the battle that would signal his downfall. The Battle of Waterloo started off in Napoleon's favor. There were spectacular charges by the French cavalry, and the British were on the verge of complete collapse. Then came the sound of thundering hooves from the distance. Blücher was back, and he'd brought his troops with him. The French army was badly outnumbered and met a devastating and complete defeat. Once again, Napoleon fled to Paris. Once again, he abdicated. The brief time from his triumphant return from Elba and his mortifying second abdication is known as the 100 Days. From then on, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France, brilliant military strategist, and would-be conqueror of the world, was on the defense. He tried to escape to the United States, but the British found him before he could set sail. Finally, not wanting to repeat the mistake that had been made by sending him to the convenient island of Elba, the British exiled him to a barren British island in the South Atlantic called St. Helena. The year was 1815, and Napoleon was 45 years old. Napoleon would never leave St. Helena. He spent the next 6 years there dictating his life to the friends he was allowed to bring with him. His routine on St. Helena seldom varied. He rose at 10 a.m., but seldom left his house. He refused to be accompanied by an English officer, as was required, so he stayed shut in instead. He dictated his stories to a secretary most of the day and had dinner from 7 to 8 p.m. In the evening, he read, especially classics. He had a particular fondness for Plutarch's Lives, an account of the heroes of the ancient Greeks and Romans. After he read, he played cards. He went to bed at midnight. He heard no word from his wife, Marie-Louise, and it isn't known whether he ever heard that she had taken a lover and abandoned him. Eventually, she married in secret, while Napoleon was still alive. He also had no news of his son, who was in Vienna with his mother and her lover. On St. Helena, Napoleon took little exercise, and he gained weight. In 1817, he began to show the first signs of the illness that had also plagued his father. It was either an ulcer or a cancer of the stomach. He became rapidly worse until he was finally confined to bed. In April of 1821, he dictated his last will, which read in part, "I wish my ashes to rest on the banks of the Seine, in the midst of that French people I have loved so much. I die before my time, killed by the English oligarchy and its hired assassins." On May 5, 1821, he spoke his last coherent words, which were, "My God, the French nation, my son, head of the army." He died early that night at the age of 52. Napoleon was dressed in his favorite uniform and buried on the island. Almost 20 years later, the British and French governments, responding to the will of the French people, had his remains shipped to Paris, as Napoleon himself had requested. His body was carried through the Arc de Triomphe and interred under the dome of the Invalides. After his death, many great writers immortalized him in poems, books, and essays. Rudyard Kipling, reflecting on the life of Napoleon, wrote, "How far is St. Helena from a little child at play? What makes you want to wander there, with all the world between? Oh, mother, call your son again, or else he'll run away. No one thinks of winter when the grass is green. What it was that motivated Napoleon, that inspired him to wander there, would be the source of curiosity and controversy for years to come, and remains so today. Since his death, Napoleon has been portrayed in many different ways, as a noble and heroic leader, and as an egotistical conqueror. Almost everyone agrees he was one of the greatest military commanders in history, and perhaps the greatest general. Napoleon himself denied that he was driven by power or the desire to conquer. He justified his conquests this way: "My power derives from my glory, and my glory from the victories I have won. My authority would collapse if I failed to build it on more glory and fresh victories. Conquest has made me what I am. Conquest alone can maintain me." He claimed that his entire goal was to create a federation of free peoples in Europe, united under a liberal and progressive government. In the states he created, this claim can be supported. He granted constitutions, reformed laws, abolished feudalism, made government more efficient, and encouraged the growth of science, literature, education, and the arts. What can also be supported is that Napoleon intended to accomplish his federation of free people by concentrating all power in his own hands. Napoleon also, unintentionally, helped create future European nations by reducing the number of states, by expanding frontiers, by bringing populations together, and by establishing institutions like he'd created in France. He made possible the later unification of Germany and Italy. But in his time, he wanted most of all to unify continental Europe. To some people, he achieved that by spreading across Europe the greatest ideals of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, and fraternity. Napoleon is often considered the definitive enlightened despot. He didn't believe in the rule of the common people, and he had no faith in popular vote or parliamentary procedure. He preferred the idea of a governing group of men with talent, knowledge, and skill who could do what was best for the masses. And he thought such enlightened rule was most efficient when backed up by an army. Unlike many dictators who would follow him in the 20th century, Napoleon was tolerant, liberal, and generally showed a regard for human life. He had been brought up on the philosophy of the Age of Enlightenment, and he ruled in what he thought was the embodiment of that philosophy. He was, in many ways, the inevitable result and the glorious fruition of the revolution that preceded him. Through his many political and social changes, Napoleon changed the history of France. Through his many conquests and acquisitions, he changed the history of Europe. And through both his positive and negative examples of supreme power, he inspired and also stood as a warning to leaders that followed him. In that, he changed the world.